Every day, we point instruments at the sky and into the atom, gathering massive empirical data that constantly revises our understanding of the natural world. For those who adhere to a religious text, this rapid accumulation of data often creates a rigid ultimatum. The assumption is that you must either reject the scientific consensus to protect your faith, or reject the scripture to maintain your logic. This introduces a severe structural problem. A sacred text is, by definition, unchanging. If we read it as a literal description of the physical universe, we are forced to ask how an immutable document can survive the constant revisions of scientific models without fracturing. Leaving this paradox unresolved creates a state of perpetual instability. It leaves the text vulnerable to every shift in empirical consensus, forcing a choice between a reactionary rejection of science or a series of arbitrary explanations that erode the document's internal logic. In the early 20th century, the Islamic scholar Sayyid Nursi recognized this friction. He wrote a formal text called Muhakemat, or Reasonings, to construct a system that resolves the conflict between faith and empirical reality through a specific set of linguistic and logical rules. His thesis is exact. Reconciliation is achieved not by ignoring science, nor by manipulating scripture. You do it by establishing strict methodological rules about what the text is actually built to do. Nursi's approach relies on a series of nested premises, beginning with the very definition of human reasoning and its relationship to the laws governing the universe. By treating theology as a discipline with precise internal mechanics, Nursi demonstrates how to protect both human reason and divine revelation from the errors that occur when we confuse their categories. The first step in this framework relies on an established axiom within Islamic theology regarding the friction between observation and text. Nursi states that when a verified physical reality directly contradicts a literal reading of a religious text, reason must take priority over the literal reading. This flowchart illustrates the mechanism. When inputting a conflict between scripture and a scientific fact, reason overrides literalism, routing the verse into interpretation. The text becomes a metaphor. But this override requires genuine reason, an intellect functioning on two distinct streams of information. Genuine reason requires accurate, detailed knowledge of the physical laws of nature, what Nursi calls the book of the universe. Simultaneously, it demands deep literacy in the divine laws and the specific linguistic framework of the revelation itself. You have to understand how the text uses language before you can interpret it. Defending a literal reading that contradicts observable reality is not an act of piety. In this framework, it is a failure of theological intellect. Conflict often arises when we apply the expectations of a technical manual to a text intended for a different function. We expect the Qur'an to act as a textbook for physics or geography. Nursi argues that the Qur'an has a completely different architecture. Every verse, regardless of its apparent subject matter, is engineered to establish specific universal truths. This diagram models the Qur'an's true purpose. It is built entirely on four structural pillars: the oneness of God, prophethood, bodily resurrection, and justice and worship. Every word serves to support these specific concepts. When philosophy asks broad questions about our origin or our destination, the Qur'an formulates its answers strictly through the lens of these four pillars. Pulling a verse out of this structure just to validate a minor scientific point strips the text of its actual function. It attempts to reduce a load-bearing pillar into trivial data. If the text is not meant to teach science, we have to ask why it explicitly describes things like stars, weather patterns, and biology. Nursi solves this by applying a specific lens. He divides observation into two categories: manai ismi, literal meaning, and manai harfi, indicative meaning. Look at this biological cell. Studying it using manai ismi, we analyze its parts in isolation. This is the secular scientific method. Manai harfi, however, looks straight through the physical structure to see what it indicates about the maker who designed it. Because of this, whenever scripture mentions the mechanics of the cosmos, it does so parenthetically. The natural world is cited as evidence of a grand, deliberate order. The text points out the precise burning of a star, not to explain the mechanics of thermodynamics, but to demonstrate that such precision requires a conscious creator. Science isolates the mechanical how. Revelation answers the teleological who and why. Because they are answering different questions, they operate on parallel tracks that do not collide. This leads to a common objection. If the text is divine, why didn't the author prove omniscience by including explicit physics equations or describing microscopic organisms? Nursi addresses this with the linguistic principle of tanazzulati ilahiyya, or divine condescension. True eloquence requires a speaker to tailor their message to the comprehension capacity of the listener. A message must be speaking at a level its audience can understand to be effective. Look at the timeline of the text's audience. The Qur'an guides a desert nomad as effectively as an astrophysicist. If it attempted to explain modern orbital mechanics to an ancient civilization, it would have shattered, sounding irrational to the people it was instructing. Instead, the text relies on universally observable phenomena. By using things everyone can see, like the rising sun or the falling rain, it constructs arguments for universal truths that remain valid across all centuries. A universal document must speak in these broad metaphors. If it relied on specific, contemporary scientific data, its primary message of guidance would be obscured. To cement this methodology, Nursi offers a final warning against treating text with stubborn literalism. He references a classical idiom, describing a tall man as having a long-handled sword. This statement is true even if he doesn't own a weapon. The truth is in the purpose, to indicate height, not in a literal inventory of possessions. This necessity for context extends beyond individual metaphors. Pulling a verse out of its surrounding structure creates a similar distortion. Nursi points to the famous drunken prayer analogy. Take the isolated command, do not come forward to prayer. Read alone, it appears to forbid religious practice entirely, but restoring the surrounding context shifts the meaning. While you are in a state of drunkenness until you know what you are saying. In this light, demanding scientific literalism from a metaphor, or pulling phrases out of their structural context, creates an internal contradiction that the text was never designed to sustain. Nursi's framework brings these elements together: reason directing conflict to ta'wil, the text anchored by 4 pillars, and a language of metaphor tailored to the human intellect. Applying reason to interpret the intended purpose of Scripture does not weaken a religious text. It secures the text, protecting it from becoming obsolete every time a new scientific discovery is made. This view positions Islam as a system that assigns value to scientific discovery. It provides the teleological container where raw data becomes evidence of a larger intent. Empirical science will continue its evolution. We will constantly uncover new, increasingly complex mechanics governing the physical universe. But by assigning the mechanics of the universe strictly to science and the purpose of the universe strictly to the Qur'an, Nursi ensures that reason and revelation remain perfect, unbreakable partners.